we all do it? The mansion, of course, absolutely sparkles now that we're reopened, and we are really in the midst of the final preparations of our new exhibition, Konstantin Makovsky, the Tsar's Painter, and that will open to the public on Saturday, February 13th. Now, there's still a few tickets available for the opening benefit party, and those of you who've been to that, it's really a great, great party, on Thursday, February 11th. And of course, members have exclusive access to the exhibition all day on Friday before it opens to the public. And if you're not already a member, you really need to join us. Your support, of course, is what helps keep Hillwood fabulous, and membership entitles you to all sorts of exclusive access and discounts in the museum shop and, of course, at these public programs. So I hope you'll join our email list and follow us on all of the social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest, Instagram, you name it. We have everything. And of course, this is such a visual place. It's really great for us to be out there, and you can see everything we have to offer. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Of course, I'm sure with this crowd he needs no introduction, but I will do it anyway. For the past 45 years, James Goode has specialized in the study of Washington, D.C. history. His 7 books include A History of the City's Outdoor Sculpture, Apartment Houses, Important Lost Buildings, a work on historic photographs, A History of the B.F. Saul Company, and a catalog of the Albert H. Small collection of Washingtoniana. Tonight, he and Hillwood's Estella Chung will talk about his most recent publication, Capitol Houses, Historic Residences of Washington, D.C. and Environs, 1735 to 1965. One of the country's leading architectural photographers, Bruce M. White, took 290 color photographs for this work. Capitol Houses is, of course, available in the museum shop upstairs. Dr. Goode was born in Statesville, North Carolina. After high school, he served for 3 years in the U.S. Army in Bremerhaven, Germany. He studied at the University of South Carolina, University of Virginia, and received his Ph.D. in American Studies from George Washington University. From 1970 to 1987, he served as curator of the Smithsonian Castle, where he worked to restore the building and collect Victorian furniture for dozens of major rooms. For the past 22 years, James Goode has served as the curator of the Albert H. Small collection of Washingtoniana, which is housed in the new George Washington University Museum on the campus at 21st and G Streets Northwest. And if you haven't been, it is a glorious building and a beautiful place for the collection to be shown. As the curator of the Small collection, he works with the faculty and students to organize exhibitions on the history of the nation's capital. This evening, James is joined in conversation by Hillwood's historian, Estella Chung. Please join me in welcoming James and Estella.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I do have to offer kudos to all of you because it is such an honor to have Dr. Goode here, to have someone who has specialized in Washington history for 45 years. If someone had offered you that you can have a cozy armchair tour of a dozen or more properties with a glass of wine in the comforts of a beautiful auditorium on a February night, what better choice could you have made than tonight? James will be giving us his behind-the-scenes information on all of these beautiful and interesting homes in our hometown, and I will be reflecting back with some interesting aspects about Hillwood. Some of these things many of you may know, and other aspects might be quite new. But I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Goode first to tell us a little bit about the preservation districts in Washington, D.C.
Well, the preservation of historic buildings in Washington really didn't get started until 1978 when the D.C. Preservation Review Board was set up. But the destruction of historic houses began in the 1870s when the principal commercial street in Washington changed. The main commercial street was 7th Street between Pennsylvania Avenue and K Street. And then it started rapidly shifting to F Street, moving from 7th to 15th Streets. And by 1900, most of the beautiful Greek Revival houses on F and G Streets had been demolished. That was a very fashionable place to live before the Civil War, and it was wiped out by the business section moving in there. There was no zoning at that time or historic districts. Then the second wave of buildings went down when the financial district at 15th and New York started moving north in the 1920s to K Street. So all of your big Victorian houses around Farragut Square were torn down during that time. And then Morris K. Fritz, right after World War II, began to build large office buildings along K Street. And that was the final episode of Washington's great houses. K Street was a very fashionable residential street in the 1870s. Then we're looking at some of the important houses that went down downtown. This is a house at, let's go back to that one.
Mm-hmm.
This is at Connecticut and K on the northeast corner. And it was called Shepherd's Row because Governor Shepherd lived in the corner house. It was designed by Adolf Kluss in the 1870s. It was one of the first houses built near Pont Circle. And that went down in 1952 for an office building. Next house was the famous Hay Adams houses by H.H. Richardson at 16th and H, built in 1884, 85. And that was demolished in 1927 for the Hay Adams Hotel. And parts of it were saved. I have in my book a house near Cleveland Avenue, Sterling House, which was being built in 1928. And the architect got the arches off the Hay House and incorporated them in there. Then the door to the Hay House was saved and put on another house 2 blocks away. This is a famous landmark at New Hampshire and Kew, the home of Thomas Franklin Schneider, who was one of the great Victorian architects in Washington. He built the Cairo Hotel, among other things. And this came down in the 1950s for a second-rate apartment house. I hope no one lives there.
Nobody's going to admit it.
And then this was a very key house, a major demolition that resulted in the designation of Georgetown as an historic district. The key house was torn down to connect the Whitehurst Freeway with the Key Bridge. And the parts were stored under the Key Bridge, and it was to be rebuilt. And Congress authorized the money, a bill was passed, and Truman vetoed it in 1950. And the house disappeared. People came down, helped themselves to bricks for their Georgetown patios, and everything just completely disappeared. But Congress established the Georgetown Historic District in 1950. This was a catalyst that caused that. The Hit House was a major loss. That was at New Hampshire Avenue on the north side of DuPont Circle, designed by John Russell Pope. And it came down in 1970. I remember seeing it come down. And Stelita Renshard lived on S Street. Her husband was an ambassador to a South American country. She was coming back to Washington. She was in a taxi and drove by it and saw it coming down. She bought the two medallions on the second floor above the door for her, the walls surrounding her swimming pool, and paid $100 for each. They were moved the next day up to S Street. So there's fragments from most of these houses in different places in Washington.
Well, it's a very interesting overview of lost Washington. But we're also very fortunate to have James's take on several buildings that are still in existence. Some are open to the public, but many are not, which we'll see in James's presentation. And of course, I'd like to start with Hillwood. So Dr. Goode wrote, Hillwood is the most significant estate in Washington that is open to the public as both a historic house and a European decorative arts museum. And so please tell us more.
Well, if we could look at the next slide. I think this is the first time that the original floor plan has been published with the current floor plan. All of the 57 houses in my book have floor plans, which helps you to see how the rooms are organized. Mrs. Post made drastic changes. She increased the ceiling height. She reduced the library to a small room, increased the size of the dining room, put in a larger kitchen, added the pavilion for movies and dancing. So all of these changes were important in the history of the house. And then she added unusual features which you don't find elsewhere. The Russian farmhouse, the pet cemetery, the Japanese style garden, the fallout shelters. I have one in the book, the large one. She had 4 scattered around the estate.
What's interesting, I think is very interesting about Hillwood is that she knew at the time that she purchased it in 1955 was going to be her last estate, and by this time she knew exactly what she wanted. She'd been practicing on running homes since she was basically a teen, and by then had not only perfected how she liked the floor plan, but the financial management of it. In fact, by this time period that she was in Hillwood in the 1950s and onward, she would call her financial office, which was on K Street, to pull ledgers from residences that she owned in the 1940s just to make sure her spending habits were just about exactly where they should be. And James was, pointed out some of the standout features of Hillwood that you don't necessarily see in other capital houses, such as the dacha, a pet cemetery, and our Japanese-style garden. As much as I'd love to ruminate more on Hillwood, I know there are other lovely capital houses that we should discuss. And if any of you have a spare $8 million, the next one is offered for sale at this moment. So let's talk about the Lintons.
The Lindens, as you all know, is on Kalorama Circle. It was moved here from Danvers, Massachusetts by George and Miriam Morris in the 1950s. And actually in the 1930s. The house was built by Robert Hooper, very wealthy merchant who sold salted fish to England. He had his own fleet of ships, and he built his main house in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and his country house, the Lindens, 8 miles away in Danvers in 1854. The house fell into bad repair because the neighborhood became semi-industrial. And Israel Sack bought it in 1930 and started offering parts of it for sale. The main parlor here was sold to the museum in Kansas City, the Nelson Museum, and when the Morrises bought it, they had the Israel agree to reproduce the parlor for their house when it was moved to Washington. It has a number of unique items. It has an incredible staircase and newel post built by Hooper's ship carpenters who were idle in the winter. And then he had 3 sets of early French paper moved into the house and installed. Those were carefully steamed off the walls when it was moved and put on canvas and attached. Here's King Hooper, who was a loyalist. He fled to Halifax and lost everything in the war. Everything he had was confiscated.
An interesting fact that I really enjoyed in your chat was that it took 7 weeks to disassemble these 15 rooms, and every part was numbered, including the nail for this house, which was an amazing feat into itself. At Hillwood, it was not as extensive, and I think in other country houses, there are parts that are relocated from one space to another. You had mentioned that parts of the facade moved for a pool area. In the case of Hillwood, the paneling, much of the paneling inside the mansion evokes the 1700s, and you can see that in our French drawing room. And in the first floor library is pine, and then in our dining room we have paneling also in the 1700s. This is really quite fun because our next house allows us to talk about the fun topic of reversing rooms and also poodles.
Yes. Very few people have seen this house. It's called Hayes Manor, and it's now part of the campus of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. It's at the corner of Connecticut Avenue, Jones Bridge Road. And it was built in 1967 by Alexander Williamson, who was the clergyman in charge of St. Paul's Parish, which is now Rock Creek Cemetery. And the floor plan is interesting. After the Dunlaps moved in after Williamson died, and they added the kitchen on the right. And because of that, the dining room formerly had been on the left and the parlor on the right. So they switched the dining room and the parlor so the dining room would be closer to the new kitchen. But the house is noted for its elaborate brickwork. The facades are all heather bricks, which is very rare. It has a water table, a raised belt course around it, and vertical bricks over the windows, splayed bricks for the window decoration. This is the staircase surviving in the house, and the house is empty. The Howard Hughes Institute bought it to get the 7 acres. They bought 3 estates adjoining. And it's interesting that Ellen Hughes lived here for 20 years, Mrs. Post's granddaughter. And she added a room on the back, which is not on my floor plan, just for grooming her poodles. I think it's the only case in Washington.
Well, today you may know Ellen as Mrs. Ellen Charles, who's been on the board for Hillwood for quite some time, and like her grandmother Marjorie Post, who built Hillwood, they were great dog lovers. And Ellen Charles told me that her grandmother Marjorie really cared how her room functioned, and this was something that she did in her own homemaking, is that make sure that not only are the interiors beautiful, but they are entirely functional. And so she mentioned how not only would a chair be seated next to a light, but both would actually work and both would be very comfortable to use. So that's not necessarily always the case in older manor homes. There was a key part of Marjorie Post, and also something that Ellen Charles follows as well too. In terms of reversing rooms, it's an interesting case study for Hillwood. Hillwood was built in 1926 as Arbormont for the Irwin family, and it was initially situated so the front axis of the house was in alignment with the Washington Monument. When Post purchased the property in 1955, the first thing that she really wanted was a winding driveway, which actually curves to the curve of the house, which is the motor court, which is not on the main axis to the Washington Monument. So again, sometimes these homes actually flip in their orientation based on taste and technology of the time period. Next, our next house shares with Hillwood its oasis in the city aspect. So let's talk about Evermay.
Evermay is at the corner of 28th and R Streets in Georgetown. And originally it had 15 acres with it. It was in 1801 and designed by Nicholas King, who was a surveyor in Washington. And it was eventually bought by the Beeland family in 1923, and they restored it and took off all the Victorian additions. This is extremely rare. This is the original elevation drawing of the front facade, which faced south, and the floor plan and the site plan. And a family in New England owned these drawings and gave them to Mr. Beeland about 20 years ago. We can look at the next view. This is the site plan showing its extensive gardens and orchards. And since it was built, the rear of the house has become the front entrance. And that elevation has rough brick, whereas the south front, which is the main facade, this is a garden now, and it has the hand-rubbed brick. And then the drawing room is quite large. The Beelands knocked the wall down between double parlors and made it into one large room, and bought pine paneling from a house in England that was being demolished.
So Evermay has a delightful public garden aspect to it, because they have lovely concerts in their gardens. And many of you know that Hillwood, we also are lucky that we are park adjacent, which allows fantastic views, right? And also we have beautiful gardens. A rarely shared aspect of her gardens is that Marjorie Post would often offer time in her gardens to friends, and particularly people she was going through difficult times. And so going through research, I found a letter from Marjorie Post to Jackie Kennedy offering for her in her most difficult moment to take in the gardens at Hillwood, and Marjorie Post instructed the staff to leave Mrs. Kennedy alone during this time period. There was a return letter on the typical mourning stationery with the black border thanking Mrs. Post for the offer. I do not know if Mrs. Kennedy took part in that or not, but sort of a lovely aspect that one could offer. If you have 25 acres, you can offer a friend some serenity with that. But moving onwards from outdoor spaces, let's go indoors to candlelit parties at McCormick House.
The McCormick House is privately owned. It's at the corner, it's at the intersection of 30th Street and Olive Street in Georgetown. It was built as two attached houses in 1840, and Congresswoman Ruth Hannah McCormick bought it in 1929 and had a local architect, Ward Brown, make it into a single house. And she added a great deal to it. She had the left wing built, which is the library on the first floor and the master bedroom above. And she bought houses. Well, she added the left wing. That was her contribution, and made it a double house. The next owner was Gordon Gray, whose widow, who is now Mrs. Payne. She still lives there. They bought it in 1957. To protect themselves, they bought houses on the left side and right side, and the rear lawns of 4 houses adjacently to them. So they have a huge property. They can park 20 cars back there. There's an alley coming in from our street, and there's a huge private parking lot. Then they built tennis court, swimming pool, private theater building, octagonal library. And the left house, to them, serves as a staff house. And it's beautifully decorated by Margaret Miller, a decorator. And she uses candle lights all across the floor rooms when she's entertaining. Over 100 candles are lit. Well,
a highlight of Marjorie Post's parties was not candlelight, although there were candelabra, is that the porcelain collection, because when you came as a dinner guest, you would eat off the collection, which was always a surprise and a delight. One aspect of running her houses is that Marjorie Post would hire extra catering staff to serve the dinner, but it was only extra caterers to help serve, but it was her own staff that handled porcelain, and so her own staff would carry the porcelain back to the kitchen, and of course everything would be hand washed from there. Another highlight of the parties as well too was the information you receive about the collection, and so in our earlier slides of Hillwood we showed the pull-out drawers. Those were from Marjorie Post's lifetime, not from Hillwood as a museum, but they were informational panels or a form of them that could be used by guests. In addition to that, if you notice in the Hillwood Mansion, there's a contrast between the country house aesthetic and the interior, and then in the bathrooms and in the kitchen, it's up to the minute technology. And the next house we're talking about up to the minute for its moment, and that is Heinrich House.
Ferengi House is a museum. It's owned by the Ferengi Foundation, which was set up by Evans. And the floor plan is dictated by site, which is the diagonal New Hampshire Avenue with Sunderland Place on the right. And Christian Heinrich had a brewery 4 blocks south of New Hampshire Avenue. That was an early industrial area, which is long since gone. Brewery burned to the ground. He built a new one, fireproof. The Kennedy Center is demolished to make way for the Kennedy Center. And then he fireproofed his house. He had concrete floors, concrete walls between the bricks. He had chandeliers with gas and electric features, a central vacuum system. There was a suction machine in the basement which was connected to all the rooms. So the staff would take a hose and connect it to each outlet in each room, and that's how they vacuum the house. It had speaking tubes, a burglar alarm system, dumbwaiter between the kitchen and the basement and the pantry, and hot and cold running water in all of the bedrooms. So it was up to the date when it was built in 1894.
Well, much to my chagrin, Hillwood does not have speaking tubes because that would just be too much fun. Marjorie is a big fan of an extensive in-house telephone system. So I guess you could say I still communicate with my colleagues by phone at Hillwood, so I guess we're sort of honoring that system, historic to the time period. But the phone systems were very important. In fact, at Camp Topridge, when you, Marjorie posts summer events, when you were a guest there, there'd be a little menu next to the telephone telling you how you could arrange for anything you'd want to do, whether it was tennis, whether it was having something to eat, whether it was golfing. You could just punch in the right extension and you would be taken care of. So I have to admit that one of my pleasures, and I'm sure Dr. Goode has had this too, is that during any type of research, but I think especially for historic homes, is that you can be very, very nosy. You get to go through correspondence that relate to a private residence. And actually one of the pleasures, particularly I have to admit for Victorian houses up through maybe the 1970s, is the stationery of the houses. So many of these estates had their own stationery with the name right up on top, so beautifully done. A place like Heinrich House is very obvious in its name, but other houses have more interesting names. So we'll move on to the Owl's Nest. Sorry, this is still Heinrich House. We're having a little bit of a...
It's the beer Juba.
Yeah. This is still Heinrich House. Just. And the Owl's Nest.
The Owl's Nest is in Forest Hills at 3031 Gates Road near Connecticut Avenue. And it was named, there was a large oak tree here with an owl's nest in it. So when the tree was cut down, the house named it the Owl's Nest and put a stained glass window in his main staircase. Appleton Clark designed the house. If we can go back to the facade, it's a great example of the shingle style. It has a wonderful arrangement and variety of angles, textures. It has very wide eaves. And the left section of the house, the 3 bays on the left, were added recently. by George Myers, current architect. It was done very skillfully, and you wouldn't know it's not the original design.
And I will just give you a little visual tour of the owl's nest. And in fact, this is something Dr. Goode had talked about, is that sensitive additions and renovations, when you're so lucky and fortunate to run a historic house, as an important factor. Our next house is named for a forest near the river.
This is not known by many people. It's called Marwood, and it has an interesting history. The man that built it was 26 years old when he built it. Samuel Martin was the heir to a Chicago fortune from his grandfather, which he inherited when he was 20. He quit Princeton, and he loved to go to the theater, and he went to the Ziegfeld Follies, and they had a Broadway hit called Whoopee, and he fell in love with Mary Jane, who sang in this Broadway show. She was 19, and they were married. And they entertained in New York, and then they decided to move to near Washington, and they bought property, 200 acres on the Potomac River at Potomac. And the house is unusual because it's the only one that I've found that has its own private movie theater, exclusively for movies. And Franklin Roosevelt came here for a number of movies in the 30s when Joseph Kennedy rented the house, when he was in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So that was a wonderful find. Now owned by Ted Leonis, who can afford to keep it.
Well, I don't know how all of you would feel about living in a house named after your mother-in-law, but our next house is. If my house was named after my mother-in-law, I'd be living in the house. But this next house is called the Ferengi House.
The Ferengi House borders Hillwood to the north. It's a Tudor revival and was built by one of the heirs of the Roebling, the bridge builder. Blanche married Carl Roebling, and she inherited a fortune. And she and her new husband, whose name was O'Brien, built this in 1927 in the Tudor style. And the Guggenheims, Robert Guggenheim, bought it from the O'Briens and named it Ferengi for his mother, Florence. It's unusual because it had a bowling alley, and it has a study paneled in oak that was removed from Sir Christopher Wren's study in Oxford, England. So here's another transformation of a room.
Well, I'm very excited about our because it's an Art Deco house, and if you've not heard yet, we are having a wonderful Art Deco moment at Hillwood. We are hosting an exhibition on Japanese Art Deco opening this June, and it will be accompanied by another interesting and compelling lecture series, but let's move on to Kayfrit's house.
Kayfrit's house is on Columbia Road, and the Kayfrit's family has an interesting history. Morris Kayfritz was an entrepreneur. He went into bowling alleys, he went into motion pictures here in Washington, and he went into real estate in a big way and made a. He bought the old golf course of Columbia Country Club when it was on Georgia Avenue, and he developed into Petworth over 700 row houses. He made a fortune from that, and then he went into office buildings and apartment houses. His own architect, Alvin Albano, designed the Kayfritz house, getting ideas from a house Kayfritz liked in upstate New York, designed by Edward Durrell Stone, who, as you know, designed the Kennedy Center. Kayfritz married a Hungarian immigrant, Gwendolyn, who was 19 and he was 42. She never did quite get her English right, and she was quoted often for incorrect pronouncements. One of the ones that she said was, "I know we are approaching the posterior of the afternoon." At any rate, the house is in good hands. It's now owned by the Field School, a prep school, and they've added a number of buildings around it.
And this last featured house begs the question, would you wait 19 years for your house to be completed? And then the second part of that question is, what if the house is by Frank Lloyd Wright?
The Martin house is on Chainbridge Road, Plain. And I have a dozen houses in my book from Virginia and suburbs, which enriches the book very much. Lewis Martin was a photographer at the National Geographic. He was a specialist in underwater color photography. And he found this site in 1944 when he was fly fishing on the Potomac in front of it. Asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house for $25,000. And Wright was busy with other big commissions, including the Guggenheim Museum. And it wasn't until 1952 that he got around to working on it. And the house was finally finished in 1959 at a cost of $75,000, which is typical of Wright's Usonian houses. But it's an incredible house. It has a concrete floor with electric coils in it, so it has indirect heating. The floor is painted maroon. Ceiling and walls are mahogany. And it only has 5 rooms in it, but it's very compact and beautifully designed. The current owner is James Kimsey, who founded America Online. He built a mansion next to it, and he bought the Wright House to protect himself from someone else building another mansion. And he sold all the furniture off at auction.
Oh, my God.
He didn't know the importance of Wright. And then the Frank Lloyd Wright Conservancy came to him and educated him. And he restored the house very carefully. He bought Danish and Swedish furniture from 1950s that was similar to Wright's furniture, so that the house looks original today. And he uses it as a guest house for private parties, and he lets nonprofit groups use it for fundraising.
Well, thank you so much for this armchair tour of a dozen of Washington's Capitol houses. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Goode here, who's been studying Washington for 5 years, and I'd like to open up the floor for a few questions. Yes, in the back.
Is the Catherine Graham, our street mansion, featured in the book?
The question was about the Catherine Graham property.
Which house is that?
On our street in Georgetown?
Which house is that?
Catherine Graham.
It's privately owned.
Privately owned.
It's private.
No, I know that. I just wondered if it's featured in your book.
No, it's not.
It's not.
Okay. Up front here.
If you were going to look at great houses from 1965 to present, would you find the greatness still?
Well, there are a lot of mansions in Potomac,
Oh, God.
but I wouldn't think I would go there to look for a classic house.
The question was about architecture in DC 1965 onwards. Oh. Next question up here in the front.
I wondered if how many other properties Mrs. Post considered, if any, before she purchased what became Hillwood.
Do you want me?
She owned Tregaron, Combe Street in Cleveland Park. And when she divorced Mr. Davies, she looked around and selected Hillwood.
Yes, and the purchase was done in secret, so she hired someone else to be her agent and to be the initial purchase. I was talking with Dr. Goode earlier that there's a rumor going around that it was the postman had figured out that it was Marjorie Post moving into this property here, because he also delivered mail to Tregaron and noticed the driveway was situated on the property and realized the new driveway going in was just like the one back at Tregaron. So apparently it was the postman who had ratted Mrs. Post out. Time for one last question in the back.
Question, do you know anything about, I understand that in the 20s, when Irwin family built Hillwood, Arbamont, there was another house built for another daughter of the family. Do you know anything?
I think that's in Crestwood.
Crestwood?
I think it's owned by Mr. Rockefeller IV, John D. Rockefeller.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Goode for sharing his knowledge with us this evening. He will be signing copies of his books right here at the museum. The book is available for purchase in the museum shop, which is located just up the stairs. But again, thank you very much for sharing this evening with us.
I'd just like to mention that my partner in the book was the well-known photographer Bruce White, who's the White House photographer. He's one of the great photographers in the country for architectural photographs. So it's my magnum opus. This book has the most stunning photographs you've seen. It's very elegantly put together, and I don't think you'll see another one like this for a long time. 500 pages. Right.